You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
But then as I was trying to describe my book project just to people, even colleagues, they would say, well, what are you working on? I said, the end of slavery in New York. And they always said, slavery in New York? There was slavery in New York? Or do you mean after the Civil War? And I realized I couldn't talk about the end of something if people didn't know that it existed.
And welcome to episode 405 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think of slavery in early America, we often think of the plantations and economies of the South. But did you know that slavery was also deeply entrenched in New York City? Did you know that African and African Americans helped New York City confront slavery, freedom, and racism in the early Republic and Antebellum or pre-Civil War periods? Leslie M. Harris, a professor of history at Northwestern University and the author of In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, joins us to explore the history of Africans and African Americans in early New York City. Now, during our exploration, Leslie reveals the arrival of Africans in New Amsterdam, and the early history of slavery in New York City, the contributions Africans and African Americans made to the construction and development of New York City, and the journey that New York City and New York State took to end slavery. But first, did you know that Ben Franklin's World has a brand new newsletter? It's called History Behind the Headlines. It's a brief weekly newsletter that offers you insight into the history and historical origins of topics in our present-day news. For example, our most recent newsletter explored the history of the United States' very first major law under the U.S. Constitution, the Tariff Act of 1789. To receive the History Behind the Headlines newsletter, plus the show notes for each new episode in your inbox, visit benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. Okay, are you ready to visit early New York City? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a historian and professor at Northwestern University. She specializes in African American history, urban studies, and the impact of slavery in the North, particularly in New York City. You may remember her from our conversation in episode 306 about memory in the American Revolution. Well, today she joins us to discuss details from her book, In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Leslie Harris.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's dive in. Leslie, you have studied the history and impact of slavery in New York City between 1626 and 1863, which is actually a very long time period for a single historian to study in a book. So would you tell us why you studied slavery, particularly in New York City, and why you did so over such a long time period that's almost 250 years?
Well, I have to say that I did not start thinking my book, it's based on my dissertation, I did not think that I was going to be studying slavery. In fact, when I was in graduate school, I started graduate school in 1988. One of the things that I was told by one of my mentors is that everyone has said everything there is to say about slavery, because this was right after Herbert Gutman and Eugene Genovese and the study of slave communities, John Blassingame. And people really thought that there was not much more to say about slavery. And of course, everyone was talking about Southern slavery, antebellum slavery. So I was like, okay, well, I hadn't really thought that I was going to study slavery, but I sort of mentally crossed it off my list as an option. And then I read particularly Christine Stanzel's book on New York City, City of Women, which is just a beautifully written book about women in antebellum New York City. And I was just taken by the themes she was discussing. I was very interested in labor history. Even though I had been told that there was nothing more to say about slavery, I was thinking about slavery as part of the American working class. And I really wanted to write a book like hers that was beautifully written, that talked about the lives of ordinary people. And I just thought she did that so well. Her book is a big model for me. As well, I read, of course, Sean Wilentz' book, which was Chance Democratic, which also major work of labor history in the Antebellum period. So this chimed with my long-term love and fascination with New York. When I was growing up in New Orleans, I was sort of obsessed with New York. I did my undergraduate work at Columbia, largely because Columbia was in New York City. I didn't really care that it was an Ivy League school at that time. So all of those things came together. But when I started my research, I was not interested in slavery. I was interested in the end of slavery, gradual emancipation, which was something that I thought was just a really fascinating historical topic because of the ways in which the extended time frame of emancipation revealed how a society dealt with a change in labor from enslaved labor to free labor, race issues, class issues, who supported it. That's what I was really interested in and what I did most of my dissertation research. That was where I started. And then moving forward in time to the Civil War draft riots. The dissertation started in 1785 to 1863 with the founding of the New York Manumission Society. But then as I was trying to describe my book project just to people, even colleagues, they would say, well, what are you working on? I said, the end of slavery in New York. And they always said, slavery in New York? There was slavery in New York? Or do you mean after the Civil War? And I realized I couldn't talk about the end of something if people didn't know that it existed. So I added on that early part, and I mostly relied on secondary sources to do that. There were several books. There were many more, I think, articles. And from that, I built up those first, I guess, 2 chapters or so on the history of slavery in New York. So I really didn't start thinking it would be a book about slavery, but that ended up being what most people know the book for, is about slavery. So I would say it's really a book about African Americans, which is why it's in the shadow of slavery, because as slavery ends, they're still both in the shadow of slavery in New York, but also in the shadow of Southern slavery, which New York is intimately engaged with economically.
Well, your book, In the Shadow of Slavery, is now in its 2nd edition, and it was such an important book when it originally came out because, as you said, everyone was studying slavery in the South, yet when we look at it, in many ways, slavery as an institution really had its start in the North. So I'm excited that we're going to have this conversation about the origins of slavery in New York, but also about their end and the different ways African Americans worked to bring an end to slavery. So would you tell us what historians are talking about when they discuss slave societies and societies with slaves, and where early New York fit into this framework about how we might think about slavery?
Yeah, I think when we're using those terms, we're thinking about enslaved people as part of the total population and the reliance of the economy, the degree to which the economy relies on enslaved labor. So Ira Berlin is the person who probably has popularized that term for historians and maybe for others, building on Moses Finley, who was actually a slavery of the classical era of Greece and Rome, I believe. And so the idea is that a society with slaves is not uniquely reliant on slave labor. It is not the main source of its economy. And so looking at, say, New York or Rhode Island or most of the northern colonies, they relied on slave labor, but they had many other ways in which they activated their economy. When we look at the slave South, the primary economic driver is slavery, the labor of enslaved people, the products they produce, cotton, sugar, all of those slave-produced items, and so those are considered slave societies. The other thing to think about, too, with these terms is that it's not only the labor, it's also the fact that the master-slave or the enslaver-enslaved relationship forms the fundamental model for other relationships, too. So some people, I believe Ira Berlin would also say this, that when you look at how the laws are structured or how the politics are structured, that master-slave, quote-unquote, relationship, as it was termed when these terms were created, that is the model for everything. And protecting that relationship makes everything in the society kind of revolve around that. Now, several years ago, maybe almost a decade ago, I was actually at a conference where someone questioned this distinction, and it got me thinking. I haven't thought deeply about it, but I'll say a few things that might challenge this distinction, particularly for a place like New York or for northern colonies. So one challenge to this idea is that everything that we know about the Americas, the possibility of wealth created in the Americas via European colonization, it's all underwritten by slavery. Without enslaved labor, without the slave trade, it's hard to imagine how the Americas as wealth-producing colonies for Europe and for Europeans in the Americas would have survived. Certainly when you look at the Caribbean, Brazil, Latin America, just to greater lesser degree, thinking about Spanish America, not as much, but the greatest amount of wealth is produced via slave labor. And even if you take the Americas as a region during this era of the slave trade, the most people who come are enslaved Africans. So if we think about where these colonies were in relationship to British colonization, French colonization, we are looking at a society in which all of the economics of it is driven by slave labor. So even if there aren't slave laborers in, say, New York City or Rhode Island, people were invested in the colonies in other places, the British colonies or the French colonies or whatever. They have investments in Jamaica. A significant portion of their production is to support those colonies. For example, I worked with Phillipsburg Manor in historic Hudson Valley. They've been recovering their history of slavery. Well, their history of slavery is one in which they are producing goods for the Caribbean. And so the wealth that is at Phillipsburg Manor is because slavery exists there, and they're producing flour and dairy products and things like that for the Caribbean slave islands, which is majority enslaved people. So if we think differently about how we delimit the economy, which we should, because these economies are very much of one, we have a different, I think, sense of whether or not these places are slave societies. And the other, of course, too, is that Native American people, and this still has to be sort of brought in, I would say, thinking about both in terms of land dispossession, conquering the land, conquering the people, but also what is the economics of enslavement there. And clearly we have, I think, more work to do, I think, to compare African enslavement and Native enslavement. But again, slavery is a system at this time that is understood to be, I want to say, moral and legal in warfare and in the economy. So there isn't a large-scale questioning of slavery. That comes very slowly. So all of these places see slavery as part of society and as part of economies.
Well, speaking of economies, in our conversation in episode 306, you noted that the British intended to develop New York City as a hub of slavery in the British Atlantic world. And we didn't have a lot of time to talk about that in our conversation, but I think it's such an important point. I wonder if you would tell us about this British plan and if and how New York City ever did develop into that hub of slavery as the British Empire imagined it would be.
New York, of course, began as New Amsterdam. The British were at war with the Dutch and captured it, was signed over to the British in the late 17th century. One of the goals of the British in capturing New York was to make it a slave port for North America, that enslaved people would arrive there and then be sold south into the southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, etc. Those goals meant that relative to other colonies in the North, a large number of enslaved people arrived in New York. Now, New York was never very successful at this, and it was soon outstripped actually by Rhode Island. And to be honest, I'm not sure of all the ins and outs of how Rhode Island won, but Rhode Island became the slave trading capital of North America over New York. And so both New York and Rhode Island, though, one of the fallouts of that goal of being a slave port is that the people in those regions themselves purchased enslaved people, or slaves if they were unable to be sold south for whatever reason. There was a glut of slaves from other places, or there was just not enough market for them. They would stay in New York. So if you look at both New York City and to some degree the hinterlands of New York and Rhode Island, these are places that have a high percentage of enslaved people, of Black people, and have a deep African American history because of those goals. I think the goal, too, again, of making them slave ports is a recognition of the wealth that is possible and is during this time in terms of having slaves, investing in the slave trade, trading slaves. These are colonies who see wealth and success as coming through participation in the slave trade. And they're not going to be plantation economies. They can't grow the same kinds of crops that, say, Virginia and Maryland, these warmer climates, tobacco and sugar, of course, in the Caribbean. That's not going to happen. They are growing wheat and doing dairy farming. Dairy farming in particular is a big deal in Rhode Island. It's also very popular in New York. those kinds of things aren't going to absorb large amounts of slave labor, but slave labor is used on those farms. And so if they want to invest in the slave market, the slave trade, I think, is the better way for them to invest. And remember, too, that the slave trade also means shipbuilding. It means all of the things associated with the trade, that it helps to build out other parts of the economies of these regions, not simply enslaved people themselves, but other things that help to make for a healthy port city, if you will.
Now, you mentioned that New York ultimately failed to become a hub of the slave trade, a slave port, if you will, but that it did succeed in bringing in a lot of enslaved and eventually free African and African Americans. So would you tell us about the free and enslaved African and African American communities that developed in early New York?
So the first enslaved people arrived with the Dutch in 1626. And there are 11 of them, and they're owned by the Dutch West India Company, which is establishing this colony, New Amsterdam, New Netherland. And they participate in the building of the infrastructure of the colony. The Europeans that arrive, some have skills, many do not, as is true with many Europeans across the Americas. And they are understood to be laboring for the good of the colony and owned by the colony. Over time, individuals also own enslaved people in that colony. Those first 11 enslaved people are all men. There are some women who were brought for the comfort of the company's slaves later. In 1644, they petition amidst a war for their freedom, and they gain what historians later have called half freedom, which is they and their wives are freed. They are given land to live on in what became known as the free Negro lots, which are just outside the city's walls. So they're to form also a perimeter of protection from Native American incursions. It's called half freedom, though, because if they fail to contribute, they're supposed to pay a tribute yearly, sort of in crops or money or whatever, but mostly in crops and goods. And they're also served to protect the colony. They must. If they fail in those, they could be re-enslaved. And then their children are still enslaved to the colony. So this, of course, means that they're not going to want to leave. And it's a way to ensure that they continue to labor for the colony. Over the course of the next, 20 or so years leading up to the Dutch-British War, where the British take over the colony, many of these half-free people negotiate with the colony for the freedom of their children, negotiate for the freedom of other people, so that free population grows. But we're still talking about very small numbers, both of enslaved people, it's a small colony, and of free people. When the colony is turned over to the British in 1664, those half-free people are granted full freedom. And I always think it's the Dutch saying, well, here, you're going to steal this, we're going to give you a problem. Here's some free Black people, deal with it. And so when the British take over, there's a substantial group of free Blacks who own land. Much of that land is located in present-day Greenwich Village. And the British take over with a population of enslaved people, a smaller population of half-free people, and whoever is still there who's Dutch, who remains in the colony. One of the things that people have said is because of this half-freedom, because the Dutch gave enslaved people their freedom at the very end of their role, were the Dutch easier or less stringent as enslavers? I don't personally think so. I think it's all about what is the purpose of slavery, of enslaved people to the economy. And when the British come in, they are much more invested in creating this slave trading port. They're much more connected to Southern slavery, to Caribbean slavery. And of course, they're connected to Virginia, where the first slave laws are being developed, the slave codes. But this to me is an indication of the growth of the idea of slave-produced goods. If the Dutch had had a similar set of slave-produced goods or a similar footprint in the Americas, I think they might well have gone the same way in terms of more restrictive laws and things like that. What the British do when they take over the course of a couple of decades is that they begin to limit the ability of enslaved people to gain freedom. The free people who owned land gradually disappear from that colony. Some people, of course, the families die off and the land reverts to someone else, not a free person. In the wake of the 1712 slave rebellion, there's a restriction on enslaved people gaining freedom. and on owning land and things like that. And so by the 1730s, 1740s, the free Black population has, for all intents and purposes, disappeared. And slavery is the predominant way in which Black people experience New York.
Now, you note in your book, In the Shadow of Slavery, that African and African Americans made many contributions to early New York City. They built infrastructure such as roads, docks, and buildings. They cleared a lot of land and cultivated gardens and farms. The labor contributions of Africans and African Americans were clearly very important, which makes me wonder, what other contributions did Africans and African Americans make to the development of New York City and its economy that maybe we don't know about or even appreciate, but are actually very important?
I think it's hard for us to imagine these frontier conditions. I myself, not only in New York, but in other places in the Americas, have often thought, what were people thinking coming to this place where literally you're building something from the ground up? I couldn't do it. If you have no experience with that kind of labor, which again, I think that there's a substantial set of European colonists in all places, from all places, who have no experience with doing this kind of manual labor. So we really are talking about enslaved people who are, perhaps they bring the skills, perhaps they're taught the skills when they get there, but who are really responsible for just very basic cutting down trees, laying roads, building homes. One of the secondary sources I read claimed that the Europeans, the Dutch, before enslaved people arrived, that they slept in shelters that they dug into the earth and that they covered with bark, that they literally didn't build their own buildings until enslaved people arrived to do that labor. So the very foundations of life, we can say, really began, in a sense, with the arrival of enslaved people and sustained by enslaved people, too. Farms, military assistance as well, serving in armies. I think sometimes we don't imagine that enslaved people could be armed, but in fact, it depends. And in the case of these colonies, where everyone in the colony has to take up arms in defense, they are granted arms and are part of the military defense in a very structured way, as with the free Blacks, the half-free Blacks, who are charged with being this first line of defense just outside the colony's walls. The other ways in which enslaved people contribute to the economy of New York, especially as it becomes a thriving port, more so under the British, would be in terms of working in every possible element of the economy. So here I'm thinking about on the docks, working in shipbuilding, working in loading and unloading goods, all of those kinds of things. When we think of slavery in the South, we often think of enslaved people as restricted to cotton plantations and to agriculture. That's not completely true there either. But certainly in New York, enslaved people are in every part of the economy. The ways in which white enslavers own enslaved people is often in one or two enslaved people in a household. So an artisan who makes shoes, or is a carpenter, or is a butcher, or a baker, they would have an enslaved person or two who assists them in that work. Some parts of Manhattan have a larger number of enslaved people in the population than others, but enslavement is widely distributed through Manhattan in the 18th century. I believe the figure is 40% of households own at least one enslaved person. That's even higher than in the Antebellum South. And so slave labor is really a part of the economy. Of course, there's also the use of slave labor as domestic work, assisting the family in childcare, in cooking, and all of those things. But there's probably almost no element of the economy that's untouched by slave labor.
We should fast forward to the American Revolution. Now, you mentioned that at its start, New York City had a community of free and half-free enslaved people, and that basically that Black community petered out throughout the course of the 18th century. But during the American Revolution, the British come in and take over New York City, and the city becomes, I don't think haven is quite the right word for it, but let's say a gathering place for African American people who have self-emancipated and run away to British lines. So Leslie, can you tell us about the work that enslaved people did to help the British, or perhaps even the American cause, in New York City during the Revolution? Actually, why don't you pause right there? Let's take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, and then we'll have you answer that question. Here's some exciting news. Did you know that admission to the art museums of colonial Williamsburg is now completely free for everyone. That's right, free admission every day for all visitors. Step into history and explore over 70,000 fascinating objects at the DeWitt Wallace Decorative Arts Museum and the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum. From intricate furniture and ceramics to vibrant folk art, these museums bring early American history to life in a way that's engaging and unforgettable. So whether you're a first-time visitor or a regular visitor, this is the perfect chance to connect with the past. And it's all free. Plan your visit today at benfranklinsworld.com/CWArt. And while you're at it, don't forget to share this amazing news with your friends and family, because together we can make history more available for everyone. Leslie, would you tell us about the work that enslaved people did to help the British or perhaps even the revolutionaries' cause in New York City during the American Revolution?
A little bit. And this is work that Graham Hodges has really investigated and done a great job with. But the British relationship to enslaved people in the Americas is complicated. They want to use enslaved people as a wedge group, in a sense, to wrestle the colonists to the ground. They want to use the fear of enslaved people rising up or the fear of freeing large numbers of enslaved people as a way to convince the colonists that they should end the war. Of course, it doesn't mean that they believe in ending slavery, as their colonies in Jamaica and the Caribbean indicate. But at those moments when those opportunities present themselves, where enslaved people realize that they can run to the British lines and the British will grant freedom, they do so. And that is the case with occupied New York. It becomes a place where the British have taken over. They offer freedom to Black people who go there. And it becomes this, as you say, I would hesitate to say haven, but it is a place where there is socializing, there's gathering, and probably a hope of freedom looking forward. So that is definitely a part of the story. As the historian Benjamin Quarles has famously said, Black people were not fighting for the British or the Americans, they were fighting for their own freedom. And that is true, I think, throughout the colonies. In other cases, enslaved people or free Black people did serve the Americans, but with the hope that that would either elevate their status if they were already free or that it would result in freedom. So some Black people served in place of their enslavers with the promise of freedom, which sometimes was not kept, but sometimes was. There are some famous spies for the Americans, I believe in New Jersey, which I don't know much about, so I won't say much about that. But Black people are really looking at this war as an opportunity to gain their own freedom. And we see this again throughout all of the colonies. And this is a pattern, this will continue to be a pattern with wars that the U.S. is involved with. How can Black people use either the ideals of that war, as in the case with the American Revolution and even the War of 1812, to say, we will fight for your side, but that should help you to see that we are due equal rights. And that, down through the Civil War, becomes the claim.
Now, what about the immediate aftermath of the Revolution in New York? We spoke with Benjamin Karp in episode 395 about the Great Fire of New York in 1776, and we learned that that fire destroyed about 25% of the city, and by the time that the city was liberated from the British in November 1783, man, New York was just a really war-torn place. It was damaged, it was worn, it was physically torn up. So what did the state of post-war New York City mean for the Black population and communities who lived in early New York? And did the fact that New York was in shambles actually turn out to mean more opportunities for free people of color to make more money and successful livelihoods?
There are two parts to this question. One is that in the aftermath of the war, as the British retreat, their British evacuation, they leave through New York with, I think, about 5,000 Black people. And these are people who have decided that they have a better chance for freedom if they leave with the British rather than stay in the new country. Some of these people are resettled in Nova Scotia, some go to London, some, unfortunately, we believe, are re-enslaved in places like the Caribbean and Jamaica. But some of the early populations in Canada and parts of the Black population in Great Britain date to this moment when Black people leave. They see their future elsewhere. In the aftermath of the war, you have a number of northern colonies that have begin to pledge to end slavery, but New York is one of the last places to do so, along with New Jersey as a state. And thinking about the fact that New York was war-torn and in need of rebuilding, which I didn't go into in my book, but thinking about that now, one of the things in New York is that they are still heavily reliant on slave labor, are unable to attract European immigrants to the city. And so part of the reason that slavery continues there is probably to rebuild that city. At the same time, we don't really see an increase in the free Black population there. This is probably in contrast to, I've been doing some work on New Orleans, and there's a great fire that sweeps through New Orleans in the late 18th century. That fire and the work that enslaved Black people do enables them to buy their freedom. And it leads to the growth and the early wealth of the free Black community in New Orleans. Now, part of that is because under the Spanish, there's the right of self-purchase. There is no such right in British America. So there's no guarantee for enslaved people in New York that they can negotiate in good faith with enslavers. And at that time, I would say that holding on to slaves, that would be a way to hold on to wealth. If you've lost your house, if you need to rebuild your business, but you have a few slaves, those enslaved people are literally capital, and so they can be sold if you decide you need to liquidate them. And of course, that's a practice in every slave society there is. Or you can use their labor, of course, to rebuild your business, your home, what have you. So there is not a large growth in the free Black population until the gradual emancipation laws of the late 18th century.
Would you tell us about New York's gradual emancipation law? If New Yorkers were so reliant on slavery, what was the driving force behind New York actually passing a law to try and end slavery?
Yeah, I think the driving forces behind the gradual emancipation law in New York are two. One is genuine moral fervor. I would never downplay the fact that there's a small group of people dominated to some degree by Quakers, but inclusive of other people, even enslavers, who began to see the contradictions between the new nation and claims of freedom and human equality and holding enslaved people. Slavery is a brutal, violent way to extract labor. The brutality used against enslaved people, I believe, begins to outstrip the brutality used against other laborers. I mean, the idea of pacifism is a new idea at this time. And for a long time, of course, working class people, poor people, people in general are tolerant of violence. But as people began to question violence, began to question treating other people certain ways, enslaved people are subject to all kinds of brutality. They have none of the protections that are growing slowly amongst other people out of this late 18th century rethinking of what it means to be human, what it means to be in community and political society with each other. So you have a small group of people who are genuinely horrified by what they see of slavery in New York, in the Caribbean, and other places. And from the late 17th century, in Quaker communities began writing against slavery, against the sin of slavery. And those ideas began to spread and gain power from the American Revolution and during that time. So that's one group of people. In 1785, the New York Manumission Society is founded. It follows alongside the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and other groups of people who began to argue and participate in government in the state legislatures and say, we need to have a gradual emancipation law. Gradual emancipation is a practice that it has, I think, a complicated moral compass, if you will. On the one hand, it acknowledges that these are people who have been held in slavery, who have not had the benefit of education in many cases, and who might need assistance in transitioning to free life. On the other hand, by freeing enslaved men and women in their early to mid-20s, it guarantees that enslavers have access to the labor of enslaved people for a fairly long time period when you consider that life expectancy is much shorter than it is today. Children work, certainly young adults, teenagers work in your early 20s or so. You're a full-fledged laborer and able to do significant kinds of work. The other thing is you're also cut free, if you will, from slavery and set off on your own right at your family building, child rearing age. And so you have to find a job and things like that. I think the thinking behind it is that you would have the skills and be able to participate as a free person in the economy in a good way, if not a substantial way. And that is true to some degree for free people. So the New York Manumission Society in 1785 quite quickly tries to get a law through the state legislature. It's unsuccessful. And the first gradual emancipation law is finally passed in 1799, which says that, as Ira Berlin famously said, it freed no slaves. It freed the children of enslaved women after they had served their mother's owner to the age, I think it's, if I get this right, 23 if female, 25 if male. And this applies to children born after July 4th, 1799. So if you were unlucky enough to be born on July 2nd or 3rd, you would be a slave for life. Enslaved people, though, regardless of the terms of the law, began to negotiate with their enslavers, and many become free far ahead of the law. And so quickly, within a decade, if not two, you have the growth of a free Black population. And then in 1817, the final emancipation law in New York is set, by which all enslaved people are freed as of July 4th, 1827, all remaining enslaved people. The second thing, though, that drives this emancipation law at the particular moment in 1799, when it's passed, there had been this moral push by this small group of Manumission Society members. But the other push is European immigration is picking up. And so we believe that New Yorkers can see that there will be another labor force that can take over what enslaved people have been doing. Unfortunately, as well, as that European immigration picks up, formerly enslaved people are pretty quickly cut out of skilled labor. So when we think of the New York City working class that Sean Wilentz describes in Chance Democratic, as well as other people, what we have is a group of largely white laborers who refuse to work alongside Black people, even though Black people have access to the same skills and possibilities, and certainly have been competitive throughout the slave-owning era. But the idea of working alongside Black people in skilled labor on the same basis of equality is anathema. And so you have what I describe as a de-skilling of the Black community, where Black people are really compressed into occupations that are not well paid, that are unskilled, that really limit their ability to be equal citizens with the rest of people, to have an equal chance at economic flourishing. And so most Black laborers, women are domestics, sometimes live in. Men are doing all kinds of manual labor that does not pay well. One place that they dominate is chimney sweeping. And so that is a business that some Black people are able to be entrepreneurial about. There are a few other people who manage to find a space as skilled laborers, but for the most part, it's very difficult to be skilled. The other major labor that Black men can do is to be sailors. That being a sailor can be very lucrative, although it's also very dangerous. But Black men tend to have those jobs for longer than white men in terms of their life careers because they can, and because it's one of the few places where they can count on having a steady income that can provide some access to wealth.
As you have studied the end of slavery in New York and the development of the African American community in early New York City, did you ever find a definitive end date for slavery in New York? It seems to me that trying to find an end date in some of these mid-Atlantic states is actually fairly tricky business.
Yeah, I had a lot of questions about the end. So we're using the word slavery, but I would say the word bondage, being bound in some way, because indentures, these indentures that people are born into, theoretically, there is an end in 1827 that if you were enslaved, you should have your freedom. But that to me doesn't answer the question of what happens to indentured, those who are born into indentures, and do they have to serve out those indentures? I'm unclear about that. The other piece, though, is that New York, as do most northern states, go back and forth in terms of what happens when visitors from places where slavery is legal bring their enslaved people to New York. At times, the law says that if you are in the city as an enslaved person for 6 months, you're automatically free. It's the free land law, I guess they call it. This was argued out in Great Britain in terms of the Somerset case, that when you set foot on British soil, do you become free immediately because it's supposedly a place without slavery? Of course, New York has intimate ties to the slave South, and some parts of New York don't necessarily want to encourage these Southerners who are coming there with their enslaved people It doesn't want to see itself as completely anti-slavery. So there's quite a bit of struggle around those issues of whether or not Black people gain their freedom from slavery while they're in New York or not. There's also, of course, more generally, the fugitive slaves who flee from the South and come north. And again, there are slave catchers, blackbirders, they're called, people who seek to recapture fugitives. They sometimes, quote unquote, capture free Blacks because they're not sure. And Black people have to argue for their freedom in the courts. And sometimes they lose that argument. So there's a lot of fear, I think, of that in New York communities. The possibility that they will be mistaken for an enslaved person or they have seized their freedom and that freedom will be taken away. It's a quote unquote free state, but there are lots of ways in which for individuals that freedom can be lost.
Yeah, and to your point about New York being quote unquote a free state, I think one of the things that has surprised me in my research is that according to census records, there were still enslaved people living in New Jersey into the 1860s. There were still enslaved people alive in this quote unquote free state at the time of the Civil War.
Yeah, in New Jersey, it's clear that they never pass a law that says that slavery ends. So New York does pass this law that all enslaved people in New York are freed as of July 4th, 1827. New Jersey just lets gradual emancipation play out. So my understanding is that the final maybe a dozen or 24 enslaved people are freed in 1865, along with Southern slaves. How that plays out in particular, whether or not they're actually, well, I would imagine they are treated as enslaved people. They're owned by someone. The other thing, too, and Shane White talks about this in New York, even during the time of gradual emancipation, certainly, is that if you have a mixed household where some people are enslaved, some are free, you have white indentured servants, Black indentured servants, that you will still experience life as an enslaved person, if you will, because it's unlikely that you will be elevated up. It's more likely that your rights will be infringed upon. That the enslaver, or the, if you want to call it employer, talking about this mixed sort of workforce, that their understanding of what they can do to people will be driven by what they can do in the worst way. That even during this period of gradual emancipation, the idea of freedom, I guess, is fluid because there are people at various levels of trying to gain their freedom. Sometimes we think of fluidity as a good thing, but of course that fluidity can be used against people seeking freedom as well.
Now, what was it like for these newly freed, formerly enslaved people to live in early New York City as the early Republic turned into the Antebellum period, or the period just before the Civil War? So I'm thinking from this period of 1827, where New York passes its end of slavery law, until the Civil War starts in 1860.
One of the things that these newly freed people do is that they began to establish their own institutions, and sometimes in cooperation and collaboration with New York Manumission Society members who have assisted them in freedom. So I should say that in terms of gaining freedom and keeping freedom, the New York Manumission Society definitely sees its purpose not only in passing this gradual emancipation law, but also in making sure that formerly enslaved people remain free. And they are very active in helping fugitives, helping people who are being held illegally in slavery during this time. They also set up schools. The African Free School is an incredibly important institution for Black people. It's not without struggle, as both Blacks and whites in the New York Manumission Society, and the Manumission Society is an all-white group. There are no Black members. They discuss and debate what the purpose of that school should be, who should be the teachers. There are some Black teachers who eventually become part of the school after a bit of struggle. But that is one kind of institution. There are Black people who also form schools of their own. In addition is the development of Black churches. Many of these churches start as offshoots of white churches that are not allowing Black people to worship on a basis of equality. And so, of course, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia has a branch in New York. The AME Zion Church is a New York-founded church. There's the Colored Presbyterian Church that starts in the early 1800s. And what's now St. Philip's Anglican Church starts as well, with Peter Williams becoming one of the most famous ministers there. These churches, these congregations are often in line with white hierarchies. So there can be stress between what the Black church congregations want in terms of being more radical about ending slavery and being more political, and in terms of the white hierarchy being more conservative about that. That's going to definitely be a tension when the radical abolitionist movement gets started. So it's a time of great ferment, I would say, of great optimism in New York. New York really becomes this beacon for lots of people. It's a time where people can imagine having their own families and households. We see a shift in the Black population from the wealthier places where people held slaves to moving into the 6th Ward and the 5th Ward, where there are Black churches, Black schools, and where Black people feel that they can have their own lives independent, of course, of their former enslavers. Now, this doesn't mean that they're living in all Black neighborhoods. They're living in working class neighborhoods. And so these are all fairly well integrated, which doesn't mean equality, but that they are living amongst white New Yorkers. Another important place where Black people own land, of course, is Seneca Village in the site of present-day Central Park. And that becomes another important site. That's actually where the AME Zion Church is located. It is also a mixed race community. There are Irish people and other immigrant groups who live there, but it is a place where Blacks own land from the 1820s until that land is taken from them by the city to build Central Park in the 1850s. So it's a time of consolidation, of growth. Remember that New York is the place with the first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, which is founded just as slavery is ending in 1827 in New York. And New York, along with Philadelphia and Boston, becomes one of the locations where the radical abolitionist movement will get started. And that's an interracial movement, but it is one that is driven, I would argue, by Black ideas. I argue, as Benjamin Quarles has argued, that Black abolitionists really lay the foundation for this idea that slavery is wrong and should be ended immediately, that this is not something that should end gradually, but that immediate emancipation is necessary. So you see in these decades the gathering together of political, economic, cultural, social community in New York City.
Now, in spite of the restrictions placed on their freedom, the danger that they might lose this freedom at any point in time, and of having immigrant populations moving into their neighborhoods and then refusing to work with them because they're Black, it sounds like Black people in early New York City were actually able to build fairly vibrant African-American culture in New York. So would you tell us a little bit about the freedom for Black people and how that functioned in early New York City, and about the different cultures that these African-American communities are interacting with that both help to expand and contract their freedom?
Sometimes we can look at this early time in New York where, on the one hand, African Americans gain freedom, slavery ends in New York at least, and yet freedom does not come with equality. There's still a lot of racism. There will be race riots. There will be people who refuse to employ them. There's poverty, sometimes desperate poverty. And so this freedom is very limited. Some Black people leave New York, certainly. There is a colonization movement. There are people who go to Liberia. There are people who go to Haiti, seeking greater freedom and greater opportunity. But most people stay, and it's always so interesting to me that the colonization movement founded by whites supports, of course, Black people who go, but the radical abolitionist movement founded in part by William Lloyd Garrison, but also by Black people, that William Lloyd Garrison becomes a radical abolitionist because he listens to Black congregations. He travels to them and says, why isn't colonization a good idea? And they tell him, we are here. This is our land. We are fighting for our freedom. And another important thing, we don't want to leave our brothers and sisters in the South. Sometimes literally their relatives are still in the South. If you're talking about fugitive congregations, members of these congregations, they literally have family in the South, and they are committed to an idea of American society that is bigger, that is better than most white Americans can even envision. And so these two groups come together in the radical abolitionist movement, and it's radical because they say that slavery must end immediately, but also that equal with that racial equality, that this is a twin goal. They understand that the end of slavery and the end of racism need to come together, that these both must be extirpated. And it's radical because they do try to live into the idea of Black and white equality in their organization. They are an interracial organization. They attempt to share leadership, to share friendships. And this is really quite new and radical for its time. Frederick Douglass, he believed the 1840s, walks down the street with two white women and they're set upon, and William Lloyd Garrison is set upon for walking with Black men as equals in the streets. These are things that strike at the very heart of white supremacy in America. And I remain inspired by that struggle because it was so new and it was so difficult, and they remain committed. And they fought with each other and they hated each other at times, and they celebrated together. They changed. They were pacifists until the Civil War because they realized that this was the only way slavery was going to end, even though it went against everything they had argued for previously. So they really remind me that freedom is a constant struggle. These ideals really go against what most people envision that humanity should be like. They did then, and we're in a similar kind of questioning moment and struggle about what society should look like. And sometimes that creates collaborations with people you wouldn't imagine. And it takes people stepping outside of old ways of doing things to sometimes move us forward into new ways. I don't think there's anyone alive today who would want Southern slavery to continue. But at the time, everyone was like, we can't imagine the world without it. I said Southern slavery means American slavery, really, slavery in the Americas. There is no one alive today who would have wanted to participate in that system. And it literally took centuries to dismantle that. Now we're in the post-slavery, which is about racism and all kinds of hierarchies, and it looks like it's going to take us centuries to dismantle that if we succeed. So I remain in awe, in a sense, of these people who were so forward-thinking and who didn't know where it would end, yet managed to just have the courage of their convictions to continue to work for what they really believed was a morally better place, and for coming together and having sometimes the hardest conversations with each other, and yet remaining committed to the goal and remaining committed to being in conversation with each other, in debate. Is this the best strategy? Is that the best strategy? I don't think they rested. Not in a bad way. I think they just were taken by the fervent of their ideas and the importance of the mission. And that's really inspiring to me. So that's how we end up with Blacks in New York as free people trying to live full, rich lives, and then their allies who struggle along with them.
Well, now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. So we talked about the New York Manumission Society that was founded in 1785 by influential citizens of New York City like John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. And we also talked about how this society was able to get a gradual emancipation bill passed in the New York State House. Leslie, what if the New York Manumission Society had been more aggressive and pursued a law for immediate emancipation instead of gradual emancipation? If they had been able to pursue this law and get it passed, how might that have altered the socioeconomic landscape of early New York City?
So my immediate thought is that if they had been able to get an immediate Emancipation Act passed, it would not have changed anything. Formerly enslaved people would have been kicked out of these places where they lived and worked, and there might have been a lot of anger. So that was my immediate thought with this question, and that there would not have been much difference. On the other hand, because it happened so immediately, there might have been a way in which former enslavers were forced to employ their enslaved people because they needed the labor. Like they didn't have the opportunity to prepare, as it were. So if the gradual emancipation law was about preparing enslaved people for freedom, it was also about preparing white people for freedom, and they had time to figure something else out. So ultimately, I don't think it would have been all that different because the larger issue, the radical abolitionists had it right that you have to both end slavery and address racism. And of course, when we look to the South and the passage of the 13th Amendment and all of the violence there that ensued and the attempt to I don't want to say re-enslave, but certainly to reharness that labor, even if they tried not to call it slavery. I think that we would have had to have a greater commitment to racial equality to make immediate emancipation in New York at that time work for a different outcome economically for Blacks and socially and politically. We have to remember that when New Yorkers passed the law in 1817 to end slavery immediately in 1827, they then went into a constitutional convention and attached limits to Black citizenship, that Black men had to own property to vote, as white men are given universal suffrage without property restrictions. Almost immediately, whites are looking for ways to limit Black freedom. And so the harder thing turns out not to be ending slavery, but ending racism. And as you know, we're still struggling with that today.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're working on a new book about New Orleans. Would you tell us about your current research project?
So in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, I began thinking about how people were seeing New Orleans through the lens of Katrina. I felt like a lot of discussions about New Orleans were very much limited to that moment. And I began thinking about how to structure a book that used my family's history to tell the history of the city as well. So it's called Leaving New Orleans, and it uses the Katrina years and my family's history in New Orleans to talk about how the city has evolved and what its future looks like now is, well, we've been in climate change, even if we haven't known it. So over time, it's become a family history and a history about race, but also a history about the environment. So it's really taken me in some new directions. I guess it's also an exploration. You can think that you know a place and then research the history and realize, oh, I didn't understand. Where did some of these things come from?
Yeah, it's certainly fascinating when you really dig into the history of the place and you're like, oh, that's where that myth came from. And actually, it's not really a myth. Like, it seems to have actually happened. Now, if we have questions about early African and African American history in New York City, where's the best place for us to contact you?
Sure, you can always send me an email at leslie.harris@northwestern.edu. I'm on Twitter at proflmh, and I respond to emails.
Leslie Harris, thank you for joining us again and for helping us better understand the Black history of early New York City.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Slavery in early New York and New York City was far more complex and far-reaching than many people realize. In fact, Leslie is not our first guest historian to tell us that many people don't even know that New York had slavery. But New York City practiced slavery from its Dutch period in the early to mid-17th century until 1827. After the Dutch relinquished control of New York to the English, first in 1664 and then again in 1674, because there was a brief one-year period of Dutch reconquest in 1673, after the Dutch surrendered New York to the English worked to transform New York City into a slave hub of the English and later British Atlantic world. Now, as Leslie noted, Rhode Island bested New York City for the status of a major slave hub, but New York City still boasted a lot of enslaved people entering and exiting its port. As many as 20% of colonial New Yorkers were enslaved, and these enslaved people were dispersed among 41% of the city's households. As Leslie described, slavery was deeply entrenched in New York and New York City, but city and state also emerged as a leader in the movement to abolish slavery in the United States. Now, abolishing slavery did not mean full equality. As Leslie discussed, Black New Yorkers enjoyed a more limited or circumscribed sense of freedom than white New Yorkers. The tensions caused by this more limited freedom engaged white and Black New Yorkers in frequent debates and activities to support and abolish these limitations. And these debates and activities are actually still ongoing today because of racism. As with other locations in the United States, New York City has had many founders: the Lenape, the Dutch, the English, the men who founded the city's financial institutions, the women who helped found the city's philanthropic activities, and of course, the Black people, who physically built New York City and who have worked to hold it accountable for realizing the nation's promises of liberty, freedom, and equality for all citizens. Look for more information about Leslie, her book, In the Shadow of Slavery, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/405. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, if you find Black history as interesting as I do, you probably have a lot of ideas for other topics we should cover. Please send them to me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.